Okay, so here we are to the last bit of this essay, paragraph 5. Allora, in the previous paragraph, benhabib has made this point that, a lot of the narratives that constitute national identities are, in fact, narratives, all right? And so here we come to the point. So, what are we going to do with all of it? As you notice, this paragraph begins this way: the limits of the dichotomy essentialist-constructivist. What does it mean, dichotomy? Dichotomy is a Greek word that you use when you want to mean a stark opposition. That is to say, in a nutshell, what benhabib means to affirm here is that evidently, a constructivist versus essentialist are two words that can be used very well by the social scientist, the sociologist, the political scientist, the political philosopher, in order to, classify different approaches to national identity. Is that the end of the day? And not necessarily. And why? Because evidently, Sheila benhabib is also asking herself the question, all right, but how about the motivation of people? Because she is also very much aware that it makes a great difference what people believe. So, to a certain extent, to say, oh, well, nations are imagined communities, fine, it explains a lot of things, but is it enough to account for, to give justice to claims that are felt profoundly by collective groups? That is, in even simpler terms, we can say that, some groups are actually motivated by these narratives. And so to a certain extent, these narratives have to be taken seriously. And evidently, the perspective of the observer is not the same as the perspective of those who are part of this movement. See, for example, what she writes here at the bottom of page 45. For the social or political theorist, or simply for the observer of social movements activating on the basis of identities, it is also axiomatic that identity-based movements are historical events. What does it mean? It means that evidently for a social scientist, social philosopher, or political scientist, whatever, it is axiomatic. What is axiomatic? It means self-evident that identity-based movements are historical events. What does it mean? React to historical circumstances. Let us be even more concrete. It is evident that for, a person that works in social theory, when we look, for example, to, let's say, the Catalonia independentist movement, evidently, for me, the Catalonia movement is an historical event that takes place in a certain moment, as she writes here, on account of certain other transformation going on in culture, politics, economics, and society. Per esempio, how do I explain the Catalonia movement? Again, I explain it with the fact that, living in a globalized world, there are these big flows of economy, finances, etc., and so it does make sense that somehow collectivities are feeling lost. Collectivities experience a feeling of loss of control. That's something that we also have learned with Bauman, didn't we? And so it does make sense, for the observer. I can immediately say, okay, I can see why they do this. The fact that I can see why they do this doesn't necessarily mean that that's a good idea. At the same time, is it so simple as this that, one can simply say, oh, well, all those differences that you're talking about are just, historical constructs or something like that? No, it's not enough. See what she's writing here towards the half of page 46. The observer perspective must not only explain the historical and sociological contingency of these movements. So it's not enough simply to explain how do they come about, but also must show how and why they are plausible and desirable for their members. There has to be a level of the motivational explanation of action. What does it mean? We have to take seriously why certain movements mobilize people this way. For example, just before, she's saying, for example, in the newly emergent queer movement, the question of how essential or significant certain forms of difference are, is causing friction and at the time splitting the movement. Why? It is not easy for members of identity difference movements to accept the sociological contingency of their own claims. What does it mean? It means that sometimes for members of certain identity movements, evidently, it is not enough to be told, oh yes, I know why you're doing this. It is because, there are some historical and sociological contingencies. For these people, it's important. For example, let's make an example that I would say now it's familiar to all of us. I think after we have read Butler, we have all understood why we shouldn't be essentialist in question of gender. Nonetheless, the fact that, certain differences related to gender has been important for some kind of feminist movement. Well, it wasn't simply because, people were numb. Voglio dire, if for 10 years we have been mobilized, as I have been, by feminism of difference, it's not simply because we were stupid and we couldn't see the point. It's because, given those historical circumstances, these words meant something. So, this also means, that it is also very important to understand what are, as she writes here, the individual and collective needs, desires, biographies, and motivational structures. So you can see what benhabib is advocating for. She's advocating for a more in-depth work on identities, a more in-depth work that should explain why people are mobilizing on some words and why it is plausible and desirable. That means that what she's advocating for is a more in-depth work that should aim at explaining why those claims of identity are so good at mobilizing people. To a certain extent, let me also suggest you this. She's also saying something that at the end of the day you can see resonates also with Anthony Appia, because at the end of the day, we say, okay, national identities are not natural, national identities are constructed narratives. Okay, let's see what they are constructed of. In other terms, Appia would say, let's find what values they are constructed of. And this is what it means, why they're plausible or desirable. So, as you can see here, from this essay, to a certain extent, by this essay, we are taken to the next level in identity politics. And why? Because we are reminded that identities are the result of constructions, so they are somehow the result of political projects. But those political projects, they also happen on the basis of claims to make this identity, as she's saying, plausible or desirable. So, and here I am putting my own words into her writing, at the end of the day, those political projects happen in the name of some values. And then, you see, this is where ideally you can make this essay liaise with the essay of Anthony Appia, because then it means to open then the real conversation. What is it that an identity stands for? Which is the mechanism that makes it possible also to have dialogues between different forms of identity. So in a nutshell, I hope with these 3 videos that I've explained a little bit, the basic points of this very complicated but also very rich essay. And also, if you notice, I put you a little bit on the way on how you can use this essay to be in dialogue, for example, with the piece by Bauman, also to be in dialogue with the piece of Appadurai, because then if you reread them together, you can see that they use a lot of the same references, all right? But also, a little bit more at a distance, you can also see how this piece is in dialogue then at the end of the day also with Iris Marion Young and even more with Anthony Appia. Okay, these were, some lines in order to make sense of this essay, and once again, I do look forward to discussing it more at length in our live session. Thank you very much e, as always, a presto.